All right, welcome to the Digital Personality Podcast, where we dive deep into the art and science of building a compelling personal brand in the digital world. I'm your host, Jackson Lintz, and today we're exploring the fascinating intersection of storytelling, content creation, and personal branding. Joining us is a very special guest, Olly Richards, the founder of a $10 million education business called Story Learning. Olly has revolutionized language learning by intertwining it with captivating stories, proving that education can both be engaging and effective. His unique approach has not only helped thousands learn new languages, but has also masterfully demonstrated the power of narrative in building a personal and educational brand. Today, Olly will share his insights on the importance of storytelling and personal branding, his holistic view of marketing, and how he's used these strategies to craft a brand that resonates deeply with his audience. Whether you're a business owner, a content creator, or anyone interested in making a mark online, Olly's experience and strategies are about to provide you with a ton of valuable lessons. So let's dive in and uncover the secrets to creating a digital personality that truly stands out. Welcome, Olly.
No pressure. Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah, for sure. So why don't you give us like a 1 minute rundown of Story Learning, what got you started in that company and ultimately what made you go into that niche, right? Because it's a very niche business around storytelling for foreign languages. So just dive a little bit into that.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm someone that's had a series of 7-year careers, is how I describe it. So, my first 7 years of my career was I was actually a jazz musician. So, I did a degree in jazz piano performance. I was playing professionally, tons of fun. And then, but I eventually fell out of love with the lifestyle, the jazz music lifestyle. You've very much got to be all in with that, and I wasn't. And so, I kind of drifted for a couple of years, and then I decided to travel the world and teach English. So I did a course to train as being an English teacher. And then I went to get a job in Japan. I lived in Japan for 4 years teaching English, and then 3 more years in the Middle East. So that was another 7-year career teaching English. And then towards the end of that, I was kind of bored. I was in a sort of middle management position in one of the English schools, and I got a bit bored with what I was doing. So I decided I needed a creative outlet. So I started blogging about my experience with languages, because I didn't just teach English. I also learned languages. I'd learned 8 languages or so myself, just for fun. It's always been my big passion, really, alongside music. So I just started blogging about my approach to languages and language learning. And after starting, I decided to actually go out and learn a bit more about blogging and how to actually grow a blog properly. And I quickly realized that this can become a big thing. So I kind of then went down the marketing route, and I learned about audience building, online marketing, course creation, stuff like that. And then, the business just kind of snowballed. Went from a blog to 5 figures, 6 figures, 7 figures. And it's now 10 and a half years old, so it's not been a quick journey. A lot of the best businesses are built over a long time. But one of the things, we didn't start off talking about stories, actually. At the beginning, it was just my own experience with languages. But then through a series of experiments and twists and turns, we kind of discovered that stories was the concept that was resonating most strongly with the audience. So I kind of pivoted the whole business towards that and made it all about learning languages with stories, rebranded as Story Learning. And that's what's been going on now for over 10 years. And then more recently, it was coincided with the 10-year mark, really. I started wanting to teach education business owners how to scale their education businesses, because that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I just continued this cycle of teaching and creating. So I started my personal brand at ollyrichards.co, where I write a newsletter about business stuff, online business stuff for educators. Mm-hmm. And I'm essentially following the exact same playbook. So I'm telling stories about stuff that we have done at Story Learning, and how we've grown the business there. So, really it's just been a whole big, endless series of stories and teaching and creating and selling and growing and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I've been reading books on storytelling and everything like that, and it's pretty much how everyone sees the world. Right. So everyone can relate to stories. And so when you share them, that's how they see the world. So they're going to be able to relate to them more. I'm interested, in your transition period of creating content and writing. What was the transition from not storytelling to being like, oh, this is where I'm going to head with my content creation. I'm going to tell more stories and I'm going to be able to attract a better audience because of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always used behind stories to get into language learning theory for a second. Behind stories is reading. So reading is a very powerful way to learn languages because when you've got a text, it gives you time to sit and be with the language. Whereas, for example, if you're watching Netflix, everything's happening too quickly, so it's hard to really learn. It's not good study material. So I'd always use reading myself as a language learning device, and so it was authentic in that sense. But so what happened was I published a few books of short stories for language learning, and they were super popular. And I noticed, in fact, we're coming up on our 1 millionth copy sold of those books, which is an exciting milestone.
Nice.
So that was the kind of the first thing that really took me by surprise. So then I started thinking, well, what if I started changing my courses to be based on stories, given that it's obviously working, and they did really well as well. And so it was through a series of kind of short experiments that we really proved that it was just a happy coincidence, because I had learned languages through stories myself. I thought that I wanted to try teaching my way. It went really well, and then so it was just one of those very, very obvious things, where all the stars align. And so then eventually I said, right, well, what does all in look like? And it looked like making our entire product range about stories. It meant getting our books, our short story books, traditionally published with Hachette, one of the biggest publishers in the world. It meant rebranding the whole business to the name Story Learning. It wasn't Story Learning originally. And then redesigning the whole website, and then starting to tell stories in our emails and all of that. So it was a tipping point where after which it made sense to do nothing but stories. So the lesson I take from that is really that it's very difficult to know these things in advance. So by putting lots of shots out into the world and watching what works, you kind of gradually get yourself closer and closer to something resembling a good answer.
Yeah. So what are the 3 benefits from learning from stories specifically?
I mean, so as you say, stories are the way that we see the world. And so, I'm not sure if there are 3 benefits in particular. There are many benefits, but the most obvious one that I will talk about is the fact that stories just give context to information, right? So if I tell you a story about how, I was trying to get to the supermarket before it closed, and I knew that the supermarket closed at 5:00. And I was desperate to get there. I had to dash across town. I had to swim through a river, like jump through hoops, run through a burning building. And I got there at 4:59 and managed to get my loaf of bread before it closed at 5. Like, you're just going to remember the fact that the supermarket closes at 5 because there's all this other stuff that's happening around it.
Yeah.
And so it makes things more memorable because it gives facts, context to latch onto. And as humans, we process information through stories, from early cave drawings to books like the Bible or the Quran. Some of the most famous novels, for example, are How We Make Sense of Life. These are all stories, and so pick your major part of life, and it's got stories running through the whole thing. So fundamentally, stories make things more memorable. They're also more entertaining, which means we're more likely to engage with the stuff in the first place. They also, in the context of marketing, make boring things very, very interesting. Take B2B. People think, for example, you can't do anything interesting with B2B marketing because it's all serious professionals. Well, I tell you what, if you're sitting at a desk and you get 100 emails in your inbox every day, all telling you about the latest update to Microsoft Office or whatever, and then requests for proposals and God knows what. If a story from me comes into your inbox telling you about something that happened to me on the tube on the metro yesterday evening that shocked me. Like, you're going to open and read that, just because the fact that you're at work or it's about a work context doesn't mean that suddenly you stop being human. So stories, they cut through, from beginning to end. You see that right now in the presidential elections in the US. It's all about what story can you tell, what narrative is going to capture people's attention. Stories are how we see the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very interesting because like I feel like in today's day and age with social media and like all these different ways of marketing, people are so promotional and they move away from like stories and like actually connecting with the audience. And so it's very hard to build that connection when you're just trying to promote, you're just trying to sell, and you're not actually like letting them into your world and how you see things, which is through the stories. And so I'm interested from like your experience, like obviously you've got a ton of experience creating stories. What are the components that go into creating a viral story? Something that's very shareable.
So this can happen on many, many different levels, right? So I typically I'm not big on social media, for example. Never have been. So the question of virality is often something that we associate with social media. There are people who are great at telling stories on social media. Nick Huber's a fantastic storyteller. He'll often tell a kind of end-to-end story that gets people totally riled up in the space of one short-ish tweet. So, and that's often just a point that's made in a very anecdotal format, instead of just a regular tweet. But then you've got stories over email, and then you've got stories over a kind of longer form blog post, and you've got entire books of stories, and there are elements to this which you can go very, very deep on this. There are entire books written on the different arcs that stories can have. I mean, the hero's journey is one of the things that's most well known, which talks about the various different stages that the hero, the protagonist in the story, has to go through in order to fulfill the criteria of a meaningful story. So they have to have an enemy, they have to have a struggle, they have to have a setback, multiple setbacks, they have to be close to the end and then almost getting the prize, but then it's snatched away at the last minute, and then they have to find another way to get it. There are all of these different story arcs. And I don't really claim to be a particularly good storyteller per se, because you're up against Dostoevsky and Shakespeare, if you take it to that extreme. So I'm nowhere compared to those guys. I think what I feel like I've done quite well is I've got quite good at using stories for persuasion and teaching and communicating online. Because you can use stories to sell, you can use stories to teach, you can use stories to just build a relationship with your audience. So when it comes to what makes a good story, generally the way, if I were to give you one very simple way that I tend to approach this, it is that I will start. Let's take email, for example. This is where I do a lot of my stuff. If I want to write an email, and it could be a single email or a series of emails, I will first of all start by understanding what is the point that I'm trying to make. What's the transformation that I want the transformation that I want to happen in the reader's mind? What do I want them to go through? What do I want them to understand or have learned by the end of having read my email? Get very clear on that first, and then I'll find a story to wrap around it, right? So, for example, if I'm trying to tell people that, what would be a good example? So I often talk about in the business context how delegation is something you've got to be quite careful about, because there's a lot of dogma around delegation. Everyone says, "Oh, you have to delegate the $100 an hour task so you can focus on the $10,000 an hour tasks or whatever." And that's, generally speaking, is true. But the problem is that people will delegate too quickly before they actually know what they're going to replace that time with. And then there are things that should really never be delegated. I mean, sales is a good example. I mean, I meet so many business owners who sort of tell me about where they're at in their business and they're struggling with sales, and they'll tell me like, yeah, the sales guy I've got doing, he just doesn't get it. You know, and we've got two salespeople and they're just not selling like I am. And I say, well, get on the phone and start selling then. You know, why are you delegating the one thing that brings in the revenue for your business? And then they'll say, well, yeah, but I can't scale without that. And then I'll say, well, that's a theoretical objection. For where you are right now, you need to be on the phone and selling. So, you know, get on with it. So, so anyway, what I'll often use the example of a Hollywood actor. So there's one particular video where I told this story about Will Smith, and it was it's more of an analogy than a story really, but it kind of proves the point. Will Smith, you know, one of the most successful, richest, famous people on the planet, he can't delegate. He can't have someone come up to him and say, "Hey, Will, you want to do this new film?" And then he replies, "Yeah, sure. I'll get Joe Bloggs over here to do it for me, to play that scene on the train." Yeah. He can't do that. Like the most, you know, you generally find that successful people are also very busy. They like work. They actually can't delegate the thing that they're most well known for. So but rather than make the point about delegation, I'll tell the story about Will Smith instead, because it's memorable. And so now I kind of get people emailing me, so, I remember that thing about Will Smith, and you know, my video team turned it into a short on YouTube and did really well. So yeah, that's a kind of very, very long way of saying I try to start with a point that I want to make, and then find a story that neatly describes the point that I'm trying to make. And that's just a very good starting point for making, for using stories to communicate about anything.
Yeah, 100%. So what makes a transformational story different than a regular story? Because, like, you know, a lot of people tell stories and some of them don't have points. One like really popular story structure, along with like the hero arc, is like the 3-act story structure, where you're setting up the problem, you're taking the viewer or the audience through a set of hardships or challenges to overcome that problem, which is Act 2. And then in Act 3, you're solving that problem or coming up with the solution. So what would you say is the difference in a transformational story compared to just a regular story that doesn't impact?
Well, I mean, a regular story is a transformational story as well. I mean, you can't, tell me a story that you've heard recently that didn't have a point.
So you're saying all stories have a point?
Right, exactly. I mean, if you've got Trump standing up saying that the country is getting overrun by I don't know what language he uses, but it's not nice. What he's trying to do is he's trying to tell the story of, like, you know, hordes of invaders coming in to the country. And what's the purpose of the story? The purpose of the story is to make a political point that he thinks that we should control the borders, or else he's just trying to score points against the other side or whatever. If Shakespeare's writing Romeo and Juliet, he's making a point about love, and about, you know, the complexity of relationships. If you have you know, the great novels like I mean, you know, take any of your great novels from the classics, particularly from the 19th and early 20th century. You know, your Russian authors, your British authors. I mean, they're all making points about life, about society. So, you know, even a film. I mean, even if when it gets into entertainment, I feel like I'm straying out of my territory a little bit, because like, you know, if you take it like your average kind of romantic comedy. You know, is there a point behind the story? I don't know. I'm not the right guy for that. But generally speaking, I mean, stories are making a point of some kind. I think the skill comes in understanding the medium and the audience. So, for example, if I'm writing an email or an email sequence, I may or may not have the space to have 3 acts in the story. It might be a bit of overkill. And if you're writing online, people don't often have the attention span to keep following, and B, don't read emails sequentially. So you're kind of you're screwed really if you try to do that. There was a great course by Andre Chaperon called Autoresponder Madness that came out. It's been about 10 years ago, and it became one of the kind of bibles of online marketing, because it taught you how to write email sequences through stories. It was one of the earlier courses that I took, and it was fantastic. And he'd talk about writing like soap opera style stuff and having open loops and things. Now, 10 years ago, people would read email sequences sequentially. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. They don't anymore.
Yeah.
There's too much going on. They're too distracted. Unless you're doing an exceptional job, which I guess is a challenge, is a challenge worth accepting. But unless you're doing an exceptional job, then you're really going to struggle to hold your audience's attention, every single day through a multi-part email sequence. And so you're going to have to understand how to structure your story within the constraints of the medium that you're actually using. And so obviously like Twitter, you can do it, but it's got to be short. You've got to be very, very unambiguous. In email, there's more room for nuance, and you can get people to read a long email, but you probably can't get them to read 5 days in a row of email.
Yeah.
You see, so I think the skill really online comes down to knowing how to craft a story that works for the particular use case that you've got.
Yeah. 100%. So what frameworks do you look at when you're writing story copy for different platforms, like email, like other marketing efforts, Twitter or X?
Yeah, so again, I focus almost exclusively on the exact formula that I gave you before, which is what's the transformation I'm trying to get in people, and then what's the story that's going to explain it. I tend not to go much deeper than that for online writing, for that exact reason, because you just risk losing people. See, already in this day and age, you're already fighting the temptation to use really kind of short, obvious copy for everything. You're fighting against Twitter, you're fighting against YouTube Short, TikTok. Like, the temptation is already there. So in a way, even by diverting from that and telling a story, which by its nature is slower, it already feels like a risk if you're not used to doing this. And so you really do need to make sure that the story that you're telling it has to be gripping, it has to be engaging.
Yeah.
And you really don't have the space to do a lot more than actually tell the story, make sure it's coherent, make sure it actually leads from one step to the next. And again, this doesn't really speak to length so much. A lot of the stuff I write is fairly long, although I wouldn't generally go much over 2,000, maybe 3,000 words at most. Where I spend most of my time is actually in the editing. So I'll pick a pretty simple story because I want the point to be understood, but then I'll go back and I'll edit many, many times. What I do when I write my newsletters is I actually print it out on paper, and I take a red pen and I go through and I mark it up, and I delete entire sections, rewrite the headline. I spend a lot of work editing on paper, actually. And the point there is that I'm imagining someone scrolling through on their iPhone, reading the email, maybe skipping bits. And I'm thinking, how can I make this as easy as possible to read? Very short sentences. I always get emails from people saying, "Olly, why is every sentence a paragraph? Why does this paragraph have 3 words and some ellipses?" And I don't generally reply to them, but if I did, what I would say is, well, look, it's because when people are flicking through your email, you've got to make it so easy for them that they can just effortlessly follow through. And if you have big block paragraphs and things, like, it's just it's a tragedy, I guess, but it's just that, again, it's the medium. You're going to lose people. They're not going to follow it. They're not going to read every word. They don't have that attention span. And so I spend a lot of time editing for consumption, and style, I'd say, because I like to take my voice and tone quite seriously. So I'm trying to maintain the flow, the voice, and the tone. Make sure that if there's any sentences that are redundant, that are not contributing to the story, I'll take them out. I have no compunctions at all about deleting huge stuff that I spent ages writing. So I'll do all of that stuff, but I don't tend to make it too complicated for that exact reason.
Yeah. Yeah, no, what you're saying with like mediums, it's so true. I mean, just like where we're heading with social media and everything, like attention spans are lower, especially in like the younger audiences. And when you said like, you're looking through the emails and like you're skipping past points, like that often happens with copy. You go to the actionable tips, you might like skip a few points. And if they can't jump to a specific point in your copy and be able to continue digesting it, then you're going to lose that viewer, right? So being able to look at it from that standpoint. I'm interested though, like what are like your key tips to create consumable stories and copy?
I think it's exactly what I just said. Honestly, I think I I know that there's a temptation to always be looking for the kind of fancier level of things. And like I said, if we can take it to its full extreme and start studying Shakespeare and all that, at which point you can do an entire university degree and all the techniques he has. But really, what I'm looking for is a simple story that's unambiguous, where the point is easy to see. I'm looking for short sentences for readability. I'm looking for voice and tone, so that because what we also want is for people to engage with you as a person, to respond to your personality. So your voice and your tone is important. And then I'm looking for consumability. How easy is it to read all this stuff? There are other things you can do, like if you've for example, if there's a point in the story where, and this is the sort of thing that makes your English teacher want to just pull a gun on you, but when you get to one of the key points of the story, you can bold that entire paragraph, because for the person who's kind of semi-skimming, it signals to them, okay, I should read that bit there.
Yeah.
And then you also want to make sure that once you've told the story, don't assume that the point has been understood. State the point very, very clearly afterwards. So, you tell the story about Will Smith not being able to delegate. And then you say very clearly, so as this story shows, some things you shouldn't delegate. And if you are delegating the thing that brings in the cash, don't. Stop it. Start doing it. Like you've got to be explicit with these things. So stories serve a very important purpose, but but it's not enough by itself. You have to also study copywriting, which I think you're angling at there in some of your questions, because where stories finish, copywriting picks up, in order to actually make it an effective piece of marketing.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm focusing very, very heavily here on the marketing side of things, but if you're using stories because you want to persuade and influence, then you have to also be explicit in what you write.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And like how I think about it is like with every story and piece of copy, like it gets translated through like every industry, like movies, TV shows, like people don't think about it, but it's all like 100% scripted, right?
Yeah.
So this has been written, this has been in copy, this has like been edited multiple times.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So what is your content creation process look like with creating copy and then like editing until you get that perfect newsletter, perfect piece of copy that you feel good enough to publish?
So it very much depends on the medium, right? So if I'm writing a tweet versus a long form sales page, then it's going to be a very different process. But I'll talk about the more difficult stuff, which is the long form sales pages, newsletters. Typically, what I do first is I tend to do quite a lot of planning. So if I'm writing a newsletter or a sales page, I won't start writing anything until I've got all of my ideas down on paper, structured and organized. So I can't remember who said it. I don't know if it was Gary Bencivenga or someone like that. But sales pages are not written; they are composed. So there's a there's a bit of a myth that you can sit down and write a sales page. It's not what you do at all. When you prepare a sales page, you're conscious of all the different sections of the sales page. You know what needs to go into all of those different sections, and you can write them completely separately. And then later you'll assemble the sales page using all the different parts that you've done. So I have a process now. If I'm doing something very important, like so for example, within my personal brand, my business personal brand, I run these little workshops every month on different topics. And the very first thing that I do is, before I sit down and write any sales page or email or anything like that, I will write what I call a positioning doc. And in that positioning doc, I have a whole bunch of things. I write down like who it's for, one single person, a precise avatar. I write down the transformation that I want them to get from it, all of the key benefits, and then all the different angles that could possibly be taken from in the presentation of the marketing material. And I'll spend quite some time getting all of that stuff down on paper. And then after that, then I might move to the sales page. And then I am essentially drawing from all of those things. So I already know who it's for. I'll know what the transformation is. I'll know what the key benefits are. I will know what the straightforward things that are easy to miss, like the actual time and date of the workshop, or stuff like that. I will have some things like who it's not for. I will know who some of if I'm presenting a certain vision, what's the competing vision, and how might I position the thing that I'm doing against the competing vision. I'll know all of those things. So then typically when it comes to write the sales page, I'll just sit down and I'll write it as quickly as possible in one go. And I learned this from Ben Settle, who said that he writes sales pages in a similar way. So I'll try and sit down, and in 1 hour, I'll write the whole thing, beginning to end. Now, it'll be very rough, but I'd rather spend the time editing the thing that I've already written than to what I really try to avoid is getting a perfect first draft, because then typically you don't see the wood for the trees. You focus on the details, but not the flow. So the reason for me to write it very, very quickly is because I want to get all the flow out there. I'll have an idea of the structure in my head. I know the different pieces. So I want to write it very quickly to get the flow out. And then I'll go back and I'll revisit it and I'll re-edit it, 5, 10, 15 times until it's perfect. Yeah. Then I'll send it to a friend and I'll say, hey man, can you just read this and give me your gut take on it? Typically they'll come back to me and they'll say, you know what? These 2 bits just didn't sound right, or you're not using enough proof here, or whatever. And I'll read it back and I'll say, damn, you're right, I'm not. So then I'll go back and I'll edit it a little bit more. And then by that point, it's usually pretty good. So then I'll just pause on that. And then after that, I'll start to write the emails. Once I've written the sales page, I'll go on and I'll write the emails, because I now know exactly what the positioning of the product is on the sales page. And the emails, the job of the emails is to point back to the sales page. So that's made it a lot easier there as well. Often some of the copy can be lifted straight off the sales page into the emails. In the emails, I'm typically telling a story, but for each of the stories in one of the emails, I'll choose to take one of the angles that I've prepared from the positioning doc, and I'll just work my way through the different angles, find a story that matches each one. And, so it's a very deliberate process of constructing the copy.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And it looks like, you've done really well in terms of aligning everything in your brand and in your business, like the messaging, the stories and everything. Like it's that kind of like 1 point method. So like when the sales page goes down to the newsletters, probably goes down to the Twitter and X posts, right? So I find that very interesting. In terms of like branding as a whole and how storytelling plays a role in that, what are like 3 overall tips that you would have for branding that someone could take and implement with their brand?
I think branding is often kind of misunderstood and conflated with things like positioning, and sales and design. These things are all a little bit different. The thing that I think about mostly when it comes to branding is that your voice and the tone that you take is very important, because I think with branding, people often think about the visual side of things. They often think about how something looks, and that is important, but I don't think it's that important compared to the other things. So I tend to think about, and earlier I mentioned that the positioning doc that I write. So the purpose of that is really to kind of incorporate all these different elements into it. So I know who the avatar is. I know what I'm selling. I know the different parts to it. And so branding, I find creeps into all of these, creeps into every different element of that. So for example, to take previously I was talking about my business brand, but to take story learning as an example. What we are trying to do with story learning is to very, very clearly differentiate it from everything else. And so we do that on multiple levels. So the purpose of story learning is to help people learn foreign languages and to change their lives with languages. The positioning of story learning is that story learning is what you do when you've tried everything else and you're finally ready to learn a language. Because we know that for our people, they've tried a bunch of the free apps before, it hasn't worked. But our stuff our courses are a lot more in depth, a lot more serious. And so people often will do like 3 years of Duolingo, and then they'll come to us and they'll be like, I should have done this, a little bit earlier. And then we know exactly what the tone is that we're using. We know who we're talking to. We know the avatar. And so we very clearly speak in that tone. And to a certain extent, it's modeled around me because the business has kind of grown up around me a little bit, but because I don't really write copy in that business anymore, it's mostly done by the team. It's kind of all understood. So I consider that to be brand. The fact that we're expensive, and we lean into that as well. We're different. We're expensive. We are like a method of last resort. All of that stuff, it mixes in positioning, it mixes in design, it mixes in branding. So like where one begins and one ends, can be tricky to say. But in almost every case, so I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs as part of my my business personal brand, and I find that in almost every case, people just don't have this properly thought through. They might go through a branding exercise, and they might read a book on branding and answer a bunch of questions. But actually, if you don't have this complete picture very, very clear in your head, then all that stuff is for nothing. So I'm not sure how satisfactory of an answer that is, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, that pretty much wraps up everything on my end, Olly. I really appreciate you being on the Digital Personality Podcast, being the first guest. So I guess direct everyone to where you would want them to go to, learn more about what you do, your newsletter, social media.
Sure. Well, so if you want to find out about my language business, you can go to storylearning.com. We also have a big YouTube channel that you can look for. Just type in story learning into YouTube. And then if you want to find out more about my business stuff, then you should join my newsletter at ollyrichards.co. And if you do that, you'll get a completely free 118-page case study that describes exactly how story learning works in exhaustive detail. And people really like that case study. It's just a Google Doc, actually. It's nothing fancy, but I kind of just did a massive brain dump of 10 years of knowledge of building that company into a Google Doc. It's currently completely free, so you can sign up to the newsletter at ollyrichards.co and get yourself a copy of that.
Yeah, that's actually how I found Olly originally, is through the case study, and I outreached to him on Instagram to do this podcast. But yeah, the case study's really good, really in depth, and you'll learn a lot just about online education, business world, and story learning as a whole, and how Olly did it all. So go check it out for sure.